I'm glad to be here, and I'm going to begin just with a short prayer. Just inviting you, we are inviting you here, Lord Jesus. We are here in your name, and we pray that what is said and what we do is pleasing in your sight and honors you, and that you would take the words, your words and your truth that you want for each one of us, and you would move it supernaturally into the hearts of each one of us. And I pray this in your mighty name, Jesus, amen. All right. Well, this is part 2 of how to read the stories of the Old Testament. Just a minor point. Some of these things you can keep in mind. You'll find if you use these principles reading the New Testament, you'll find them sometimes helpful and sometimes not, because they have a different style of storytelling in the New Testament than they do in the Old. But the first one that I talked about last time, just to summarize, is that when we read these stories, we should read them as stories, which seems like a very basic kind of a thing, but we can end up thinking of them sort of as a lesson rather than a story. And they are actually stories, meaning they are literary constructions, and they have the characteristics of a literary construction. It would be like the same thing, me saying this is like, if you're going to watch Gilligan's Island, watch it as television, okay? And actually, that would give you insight into Gilligan's Island. I mean, you start thinking, well, Gilligan's Island, I mean, this shows my age, and I'm using Gilligan's Island, okay? Wait. I can pretend to be younger and say, oh, I have no idea what you're talking about. Watch Seinfeld as television, and you're going to realize that, well, even that, oh gosh, and that's my idea of a new show. Okay. Yeah. Because you'll start noticing they have things like commercial breaks, and that will change. That will alter the narrative shape of the show, and you'll start noticing that certain shows use one camera, and certain shows use 2 cameras. For example, some shows will have an audience. Some shows have a laugh track, telling you when they want you to laugh, whether it's funny or not. And then some shows have abandoned the laugh track altogether. So you start noticing these features. And the same thing, stories are stories. They have characters, they have tension, they have resolution, they have plot twists, and they're planned in that way. Some of them, as you read these things carefully, you'll find, you'll start noticing that the stories do feel different. Like the stories in Genesis and the stories in Joshua have a different feel to them because they're written by different human writers. And like, for example, Ruth and Judges are very carefully composed on the macro level, much more carefully composed than Samuel, for example. But Samuel is probably the deepest as far as being focused on psychology, the psychology of the people involved. It's why it is the most interesting of all the books. Scholars who study them as stories and narrative, Samuel is their favorite because just how deep and literary it is. Okay, moving on. The second thing I'd said is details. The details are important, but they're not always clear. And the details of the stories, there aren't many of them, like visual details and a little additional bits here and there. There's not many of them. And that implies that they're important when they are there. They're purposeful. And so when you notice a detail, pause for a second and think, why should I know this detail? How does this affect the story? And you will find that sometimes we all agree on why the detail's there. Sometimes we'll have different opinions on the details. And so the details are important, but they're not always clear. But the main point of the story is always clear. There are some points in the story of Goliath that people disagree about. Like, why did Saul not recognize David? There's numerous arguments about this. Saul at the end is like, whose son is this? But everybody understands the story of David and Goliath, right? You're not going to miss that. And that's the great thing, is if you learn how to read these stories a little deeper, you're not going to find that you have been misunderstanding them all this time, which I find refreshing. And unless there is one kind of mistake we can make, and that we do make, which does alter our understanding, but you're going to hear about that today. Okay, the first of the new ones is, as you read the stories of the Old Testament, get to know the characters by watching what they do and listening to what they say. We can be used to, in our stories, thinking that this guy is smart because the narrator says, Dr. Zarkov is very smart, right? Now, that's actually, among writers, bad writing. You should just actually write a smart character, and the reader can just tell that he's smart from how he speaks, from the stuff he knows. But we can be expect to be spoon-fed things. And there are occasionally places in these stories that do spoon-feed us what to think about a certain person. But mostly, we get to know the character as a person by just watching them and listening to them. And that's how we get to know Jonah. People don't tend to be big fans of Jonah if they have read the book. Because you get to know, you see his heart, you see his attitude, and you're like, not the best. I mean, he wouldn't come to my house, wouldn't darken my door, wouldn't bring me the gospel, that's for sure, because I'm a filthy pagan. My ancestors were squatting in huts and worshiping idols when Jonah was around. I was one of those people. Here's the thing. Jacob is, in the story of Jacob, he is traveling off, trying to go and find a wife, and he spends the night in a place called Bethel, and he sees a vision of angels coming and going, the stairway to heaven or ladder to heaven, and he wakes up and he says, surely, oh no, God is in this place, and I didn't know it, right? And so he ascribes holiness, specialness to the place, not to his relationship to God. It's like as if he had walked another 3 miles, he would have missed God altogether, kind of a thing. But we have here's what he says. He says, then Jacob made a vow, saying, if God will be with me. Oh, I didn't say. God made a big promise to him. God said, I'm with you. I'm going to bring you back safely. Give me these promises. Then Jacob says, if God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. And this stone which I have set up for a pillar shall be God's house. And of all that you give me, I will give a full tenth to you. So just pay attention to what he's saying there. I mean, there's a lot of sort of negotiation there, not a lot of faith, right? And he doesn't have, you, just by paying attention to what he says, you can get to know him as a person. Now, here's another one I think is a great example, as Absalom is the son of David. Absalom has murdered his brother for good cause, in some ways. I mean, he had a reason to do it, but he's been exiled. And he ran away, and then anyway, he gets brought back to Jerusalem sort of grudgingly. But David won't see him. His dad won't see him, and so he's a social pariah. If the king won't see you, nobody else is going to go to your parties when you host a party, right? And nobody's going to invite you to their party. So here's what Absalom does in 2 Samuel. So Absalom sent for Joab. Joab's the general of the armies, very close to David, to send him to the king. But Joab would not come to him because Absalom is a pariah, right? And he sent a second time. Joab would not come. So he said to his servants, see, Joab's field is next to mine, and he has barley there. Go, set it on fire. So Absalom's servants set the field on fire. So Joab arose and went to Absalom and said to him, do you think he said, why have your servant set my field on fire? No, he came in a rage. What are you doing? You set my field on fire. Absalom says, hey, I asked you to come over here. I sent you, why have you, come here, that I may send you to the king to ask, why have I come from Geshur? It'd be better for me to be there still. Now go, let me go into the presence of the king. And if there's guilt in me, let him put me to death. And so Joab went to the king and on and on. So, but you see what Absalom did. Absalom wanted to get Joab's attention. What does he do? Burn his field down. And he'll come at me and he'll be mad as anything. Did that seem to matter to Absalom? Not at all. Was that actually an intelligent way to get what he wanted? Yeah, he's a smart guy. He's also ruthless. He is intelligent and ruthless. And you just see that through what he did. And so then you're not surprised when he plots to overthrow his father. And he does a pretty good job of it. So, the next thing. The next point, that was get to know characters by watching what they do. The second point is judge for yourself. And by this I mean, the authors of these stories assume that the reader is familiar with the law of Moses, with the general wisdom of God. And they assume you are going to be evaluating what's happening. They're not going to spoon feed to you what is good and what is bad. And I said that there's a point that might mess up your interpretation, and it's this one. A lot of the time, we read the Bibles and the Bible stories, and we think these are the heroes of the Bible. These are examples. But they're not examples. They are stories of God interacting with us. And the people that he's highlighting are not highlighted because they're the ones that we need to be like. Often they're highlighted because they're the ones we are like. We're a lot more like Jacob than we'd like to admit. Dodging, weaving, trying to get the best deal we can. So when things happen in the Bible, we don't assume that what they've done is the right thing. For example, Judges 8. Gideon said, okay, and Gideon has, can you go back one? Gideon came to the Jordan and crossed over, he and the 300 men who were with him. Gideon has fought the Midianites, he's defeated them, he's chasing them now. They're exhausted, yet pursuing. He said to the men of Succoth, that's a town, please give loaves of bread to the people who follow me, for they're exhausted, and I am pursuing after Zebah and Zalmunna, the kings of Midian. And the officials of Succoth said, are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna already in your hand, that we should give bread to your army? So Gideon said, well then, when the Lord has given Zebah and Zalmunna into my hand, I will flail your flesh with the thorns of the wilderness and with briars. And from there he went to Penuel and spoke to them in the same way. And the men of Penuel answered him as the men of Succoth had answered. Now, think of it from these, and he said to the men of Penuel, when I come again in peace, I will break down this tower. So they had a tower, in a defensive tower in the town. So, though, think of it from the point of view of these villages. Some guy comes by with 300 men and claims that he has completely defeated the Midianites and wants their support. And they're thinking, the Midianites have been coming here every year, and there's a whole lot of them. We don't have to attack you, but we don't have to feed you either, right? So he got angry with them, made these promises. Well, he does defeat, he captures Zebah and Zalmunna. That's another story. And then when he's done, let's go to 14. He captured a young man of Succoth and questioned him. And he wrote down from the officials and elders of Succoth 77 men. And he came to the men of Succoth and he said, behold, Zebah and Zalmunna, about whom you taunted me, saying, are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna already in your hand, that we should give bread to your men who are exhausted? And he took the elders of the city, and he took thorns of the wilderness and briars, and with them taught the men of Succoth a lesson. And he broke down the tower of Penuel and killed the men of the city. Now, I actually have read a commentator who said these people deserved it because they had rejected the word of the Lord's anointed. But that is just the result of us assuming this must be good, and you're just trying to figure out why. But the author did not assume you would think that assume it's good. Gideon isn't a perfect guy. In fact, he's far from perfect. This is not his only thing he did that was wrong. Here's another one. Samson. Samson has gone back and forth fighting the Philistines. Then 3,000 men of Judah went down to the cleft of the rock of Etam and said to Samson, "Do you not know that the Philistines are rulers over us? What then is this that you've done to us?" And he said to them, "As they did to me, so have I done to them." You see his ethics? That's it. That's his ethics. Yeah. And in fact, Samson is I don't have time to get into Samson, but he's the most narcissistic person in the Bible. His problem with vengeance makes his problem with women seem small in comparison. I mean, he is a very flawed person. And as you read these things, you will find out that, like, okay, when I was younger, and I've heard it said many times, the Bible doesn't hide the flaws of its people, and that's true. And they've pointed out all the characters have a flaw, except Daniel for some reason. Like, what's wrong with Daniel? Daniel is just great. But all the others, you can find something wrong with all of them. They'll say David had Bathsheba. Samuel wanted to anoint the good-looking son. Everybody has something that they did. But as you read this deeper, you'll realize that those are just the low points of their life. That they actually have a generous assortment of faults. And David's fault is not just Bathsheba. David is not a perfect person. Samuel is far from perfect. And you can see in many of the stories of Samuel, you can see flaws in his character. Elijah, many flaws in his character, or a flaw that you see coming out again and again and again. And we may have a tendency to say, oh, well, Samuel's trash and Elijah's trash. Because look at that, Samuel just couldn't, both of those men had issues that they got used to being the smartest guy in the room, spiritually speaking. And they both had issues with the Lord raising up other people to be used. And that tainted their ministry. But the Lord was fine with them. The Lord loved them. The Lord used them. Elijah came back and spoke to Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration. Okay? And that should give you encouragement as you look at yourself and say, yeah, I'm talking about you, whoever you are. Yeah, I mean, you have this thing Spurgeon said, if somebody thinks badly of you, don't worry about it. You're far worse than he thinks. So that may have been G.K. Chesterton. I forgot which one of the two. And the thing is, it's true. It's like there are things about us. We are people who we present ourselves like a grocer presents strawberries, with the largest ones on the top of the package, right? And the little ones that aren't ripe stuck at the bottom. And that's how we present ourselves. And that's how we sometimes present ourselves to ourselves. And as you read the stories of the Old Testament, you'll see they're the same. They're the same. And so, like Elijah, for example, Elijah goes, he has a confrontation with Baal and the worshipers of Baal on Mount Carmel. Fire comes down from heaven. The people of Israel bow down and say, the Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God. He kills all the false prophets and priests. And then Jezebel says, well, I'm going to kill you. And he runs away. And he runs all the way down to Mount Sinai. They call it Mount Horeb. It's the same place. And to make the story short, he goes there, and he's sort of a new Moses. He has 40 days of fasting, just like Moses did, and he's on Mount Sinai. The Lord appears to him, and the Lord says, what are you doing here, Elijah? And Elijah says, I'm the only one left. Everybody's been killed, and there's nothing, and nobody's following you, and there's nothing. Well, I mean, Israel just said, the Lord, he is God, the Lord, he is God. I mean, so you say, well, he's lost some perspective there. And then the Lord sends fire, but the Lord is not in the fire. The Lord sends an earthquake. He's not in the earthquake. The Lord sends wind. He's not in the wind. And then he speaks in a still and small voice to Elijah. And there's a point in this, and that is that the Lord does not always work through massive, huge things. That, in fact, his preferred way of working is very quietly, in a quiet way. His preferred way of talking to us is quietly with a still small voice, not with visions and dreams and all those things. He can use those as appropriate, but the way that Jesus dealt with him was by just a still small voice. And that's the way he wants for us. And the Lord is in charge whether Elijah sees massive things, which he had just seen but forgot about, or not. Well, okay. That's the point we as the reader can get. After God does this, he says to Elijah, what are you doing here, Elijah? And Elijah said, I'm the only one. He says what his answer is word for word what he said before. Well, now the point of reading it as a story, if a person answers the same question, word for word the same, it implies that he did not get the point of the lesson in the middle. Okay? He didn't get that point. And so this is why he actually does not follow God's directions. God gives him very specific instructions of what to do, and he simply doesn't do them after that. But he's still God's man. He's still God's prophet. The Lord still uses him in great and mighty ways, because even though he's flawed. But, so you judge for yourself. That's the point. Okay, well, to back up, doing my pedagogy, remember, read them as stories. Details are important, but not always clear. The main point's usually clear. 3, get to know characters by watching what they do and listening to what they say. And then judge for yourself. Now, next point. That is, the narrator is right, but the characters are not always right. So, in these stories, this is more of an issue from the 20th century forward, when in our stories, we now have unreliable narrators, which can be really an interesting story. In fact, some of my stories I've written as an amateur have unreliable narrators. I think it's fascinating trying to figure out, is the narrator telling you the truth or not? But in the Bible stories, the narrator speaks with the voice of God. The narrator is not God. You need to distinguish. The narrator is not God speaking. It is the narrator, an unspoken, invisible third party telling you the story. But when the narrator speaks, the narrator is able to knows what's happening inside people's hearts. The narrator is effectively speaking omniscient. So if the narrator says something, you can trust it. You put that in the bank. When God says something in these stories, you can trust it and put that in the bank. If Samuel says something, judge for yourself, right? So here's a great place, which is to illustrate this. 1 Samuel 31. This is the death of Saul, King Saul. The battle pressed hard against Saul, and the archers found him, and he was badly wounded by the archers. Then Saul said to his armor-bearer, draw your sword and thrust me through with it, lest these uncircumcised come and thrust me through and mistreat me. But his armor-bearer would not, for he feared greatly. Therefore Saul took his own sword and fell upon it. And when his armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell upon his sword and died with him. And Saul died, and his 3 sons, and his armor-bearer, and all his men on the same day together. So that's the end of the life of Saul, which as a character is a very interesting guy. So you read that, just pay attention to Saul. He is not all a villain. He's a mixed bag. very interesting mixed bag. And his death actually is tragic, but it also shows he's the king, and he is doing his best to defend his people, and he sacrifices his life to do it. He just, the Lord had turned away from him for reasons. As you study his life, you see why. But he was not utterly selfish, So we saw him die there. The narrator told us how he died. Well, 2 Samuel, which is the same book, by the way, all of the Old Testament books where you have a 1 and a 2, first and second, they're all really just one book, just so you know. They're divided. It just means first scroll, second scroll. They're too long to be on one scroll. They were considered. Anyway, long story. Well, actually, too long for right now. Then a man came to David and said, "Hey, I brought news of Saul's death." So David said to the young man who told him, "How do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead?" And the young man who told him said, "By chance, I just happened to be on Mount Gilboa, just wandering through a battlefield, and there was Saul leaning on his spear. And behold, the chariots and the horsemen were close upon him. And when he looked behind him, he saw me and called to me, and I answered, 'Here I am.' And he said to me, 'Who are you?' And I answered him, 'I am an Amalekite.'" Interesting. "And he said to me, 'Stand beside me and kill me, for anguish has seized me, and yet my life still lingers.' So I stood beside him and killed him, because I was sure that he could not live after he had fallen. And I took the crown that was on his head and the armlet that was on his arm, and I brought them here to my Lord." Well, so this Amalekite claims that he killed Saul, and he's going to David. He knows David is a kind of a rival to the throne, and that Saul's been hunting David. He expects a reward. Well, David says to him, "How are you not afraid to lay your hands on the Lord's anointed?" That he just says to one of his men, "Just kill him." So I think about it. Can you imagine just be able to say that to somebody? Just take him out, just kill him. And they did. They just and having guys around, they're like, "Oh, all right." So so they killed him. And commentators, plural, many of them, this is a thing that for a long time, back and forth, centuries, figuring out what actually happened to Saul. And we have all these various, well, Saul fell in this thing, but he didn't actually die. He then got up again, and this guy killed him. They're trying to merge these two stories. But it's much simpler to say the guy was lying. We already know how Saul died. So we see that Saul's death, this guy's version of Saul's death, he's lying. That's it. Simple. Now, I did read a commentator who was very bothered because this meant that David had killed a man for a crime he hadn't committed. It's like, David also is a human being, the guy comes and confesses to a crime, and David executed a sentence on him, right? So I don't have a problem with that at all. But you see, that's an example of paying attention to the narrator. Like it says, that's a bit controversial. Too much, I would take too long. Anyway, if you really want to know what I'm talking about, you know where to find me. So, the last one of the points is, as you read this, pay attention to what God is doing in the stories and how people are relating to God. Because that's why the stories are here. If you thought of the fact that God has allowed himself to be a character in a story, talk about a reduction. Talk about a reduction. He is allowing himself to be just a character in our stories because he wants to interact with us in that way, and he wants to know us, and that's the way that we get to know people. So he is a character in the stories. He is the most important character in the story. Even when he's not mentioned, he is the most important character of the story. He is the hero of the Bible. He's the overarching hero of the Bible. And everything that humans are doing is all ultimately about how they're relating to God. So pay attention to what God does and doesn't do. Jacob is a great example. Reading Jacob's life carefully and paying attention to the decisions he makes, you see a man who does haltingly grow in his trust in his God. And he grows, and then he actually steps back because he lost his son Joseph, right? He lost his wife, she died, and then he lost his son Joseph, and then he refuses to trust God for a while. That's not something that any of us would ever do, right? It's because he's just some stupid guy. Well, what do you see? God has done all this other stuff for you. Well, I can tell, in my life, I remember very specifically actually saying to God, because things have been going great, and then in trusting him, I took a step which the results were not what I wanted at all. And I actually stepped back. And I said, it's like the results, I don't know. I don't know. And so if you pay attention to that. Now, one example you will see, one thing you will learn as you do this is there is a common human attitude that the scriptures do not commend, and that is fatalism. And fatalism, the idea that God has sort of planned everything anyway, so it's all just going to happen the way it is. This is a common attitude across the whole world. Even outside the Christian world, people are fatalistic. In fact, even more fatalistic outside the Christian world than in the Christian world. But we can tend to fatalism. And sometimes our theology can push us into fatalism if we're focused on a theological idea instead of the illustrations of how God actually deals with us, right? So, and it's funny. While I was preparing this morning, I went to print this thing off, and I saw that my printer had pulled 6 pages and it printed this, and then that one line, and then the rest of this, proving that the printer is doing its job as a printer, which is mainly to test the character of human beings and give us opportunity to grow, which is what I think of printers, and this one in particular. And I said, taka vie život, which means, in Croatian, is Croatian for that's like is life. That's life. It just means that's life. I was that's life. And then I thought, that's rather fatalistic, isn't it? Printing out this thing on fatalism, and I say, of course, you know what? I can get it. I can clean the rollers on my printer, can't I? I can research why is it pulling 6 pages, even though I've only printed less than 100 pages ever on this printer, and it's already pulling 6 pages. Afterwards, we'll have a testimony time of how much you hate your printer, and you can tell us it's brand and we'll avoid it, and then one of you will say, my Xerox is great, and we'll all buy Xerox, or whatever. So, anyway, I'm getting going here. So we actually do, the Lord does give us a lot of what we now call today agency. We do have a lot of ability to make alterations and changes in the course of our life. And in fact, the course of our life is not entirely, but is significantly impacted by the choices we make. And this is, now whatever is happening behind the scenes in the secret counsels of God, as far as how he rules the world and decides about human action and all that, that is in the secret counsel of God. I don't know what's happening. But all I know is what he wants from us, what he has shown us in the Bible, is that our choices are very significant. And we have seen that from the beginning, from Genesis chapter 3, and the choice to eat the fruit in the garden. The whole rest of the Bible has been the fallout from that decision. And so you will not see this example commended in the Bible, though you will see it in characters, but it's not commended. One way that we can see this is Eli, the high priest of Israel, was not a good high priest. And his sons were even worse than he was, and they were doing terrible things. And the Lord sent a prophet and prophesied against them, and nothing happened. And then the Lord spoke to the little boy Samuel and told Samuel a message for Eli, which is, I have seen what you've done, and the things your sons have done. And so I'm not going to destroy your house to the end, but your sons are going to die, and your descendants, I'm going to throw them out on the street to beg for bread. That's what they're going to do. Your family is going to be thrown out on the street to beg for bread. And Eli, gets Samuel to tell him this thing, and Samuel tells him, and Eli says, well, it is the Lord. Let him do what seems to him to be good. And we say, oh, well, Eli's got some depth of faith there, right? He said, it's the Lord. Let him do what he wants. I mean, he's in submission to God. And just hold that thought. And then you fast forward to the end of the book, towards the end of the book, David commits his sin with Bathsheba, totally wrong, and completely evil. And the Lord says that the child born out of that sin is going to die, and the child becomes sick. And David tears his clothes, fasts, weeping, fasting, prayer, sackcloth, and then the child actually dies. And the servants are afraid to tell him the child has died, because they think, wow, if just the child being sick caused him to act like this, how much worse will it be when the child actually dies? They're afraid he's going to try to jump off the balcony or something. And he can tell, he hears the whispering. He says, is he dead? They said, yes, he died. And so David gets up, washes his face, puts on his clothes, and goes about his business. And they say, well, why did you do that? It's a total reverse of what the culture says to do. And he says, while he was still alive, there was always a chance. Maybe the Lord would be merciful. Now it's over. I can't do any more, but I will go to him someday. And so you see there, this is a case where where this story is the exact parallel of Eli's story. The same situation, a parent being told that his child is going to die. And you see two different reactions to it. And one of them is a person the Lord has commended, and the other is a person the Lord has not commended. Right? So, Eli, you start reflecting then on what's wrong with Eli's attitude to say, well, he's the Lord. Let him do what he wants. It's how is his attitude towards God different than his attitude towards the weather? It's not. It's the same. Well, it's raining. It's going to rain. What can I do about it? Eli doesn't have a sense that he is relating to God, that God is a person that he relates to, that he can talk to, that he can beg, who could change what he does. Because he does do that. He does say, I was going to do this thing, but because you have reacted in this way, I'm going to do a different thing. He explicitly says that in Jeremiah. He says, this is how I treat people. He relates to us in an actual relationship. He isn't a vending machine or the weather or something like that, or a boss with only a one-way communication thing who can intercom you and tell you what to do, but doesn't ever hear anything back. So he's not like that. David understood this about God, and you see it illustrated in that parallel story. And I believe that is intentional on the part of the writer, that you have Eli contrasted with David. You also have Saul contrasted with David, but that is for another time. So in summary, when you read the stories in the Old Testament, read them like stories, because they have characters, they have plot twists, they're exciting. You have changes of point of view, which if this is new material at the end, the teacher says, don't ever put in new material during the summary. Okay, I'm breaking that rule. He says, for example, here's just a thing. When the Bible uses the word behold, that almost always, that signals a change of point of view. Just point it, like they'll say, and like last time I talked about King Ehud who killed King Eglon, or an Ehud who killed King Eglon, and Eglon's men were trying to get into the room where they thought he was on the toilet, and we've already seen Eglon dead. And then they're trying to get in. That means point of view is we're watching them try to get through the door. And then the door breaks open and it says, and behold, Eglon is dead. So we're then switching point of view from us watching them trying to get in to their point of view, seeing Eglon, for example. And you'll see that throughout the Bible, though Judges uses it quite a bit. So read them like stories. They function like stories. Details are important, but not always clear. So pay attention to them, but don't stake your life on them. But the main point is clear. Get to know the characters by watching what they do and listening to what they say. Remember that the narrator's right, but the characters are not always right. And that's part of watching what they do and listening to what they say. You can see their perception of the world by listening to what they say. And then pay attention to what God is doing and how people are relating to God, because that's why these stories are here. Amen.